Hi and welcome to Cherry Pie Math. This video is going to go over some tips and tricks about how to solve word problems involving fractions. This is not going to have any kind of polynomials, but it is kind of nice to go over these tips because it doesn't just apply to fractions, it applies to a lot of different word problems, especially the kinds that you'll see later on in the ACT. So before we get started, you do need to know these two things. You need to be pretty good at going between division to fractions, decimals to percentages, back and forth. And you also need to know how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. I've included the links to these videos that I've made before. And once you feel comfortable with it, you can kind of get started. So some tips that I have found throughout doing word problems is first, draw pictures. I can't stress this enough. Students will try to do it without drawing pictures, and then they'll get lost in the amount of words, and it just seems so overwhelming. But when you draw a picture, it helps it to make sense, and it allows your brain to be able to put it into an organized form. So pictures or just some kind of a flow chart to keep track of the information will help you so much. Some other tips is figuring out which operation you're using. Of pretty much always means multiplication, and I'm not going to say it's always going to say of because sometimes it won't. But when you're trying to apply like a ratio or a percentage, the of means multiplication. So that's a pretty quick giveaway. And then more or less means addition and subtraction. Another tip, use all the numbers you're given. Why would I write an extra number? It takes me enough effort to write a number in the first place. Use all the numbers you're given because you're probably going to use them all. Make sure the answer makes sense. Something that will happen sometimes is that students will solve it and then they'll get like a negative number when the answer is obviously supposed to be positive. Like they'll be trying to solve for a weight and then they'll get a negative weight and they write that as their answer. That doesn't make any sense. So make sure your answer makes sense in the context of the problem. Remember to put units in your final answer. Some teachers are super specific about this. They'll dock a ton of points if you don't put units. These aren't like necessary, but I would recommend if you have a mixed fraction, I would change it to an improper fraction while you're working through the problem. And similarly, if you have a percentage, I would change it to a decimal just because it makes the math a little bit easier, especially when you're using calculators. And then finally, always simplify. If your answer is 10/12, that's not a final answer. It should be 5/6 because you need to make sure it's the smallest possible fraction you can have, the simplest fraction. So let's do some examples. First, a farmer needs to put up some fencing for his pigs. He's going to make a rectangle. Okay, so right away I can draw this beautiful rectangle that I have. The width is going to be 3.5 yards less than the length. The length is 6.25 yards. So we know that the length is 6.25, and I want to find the width. What is the width? So I drew a picture. Because it's saying like less, it's probably going to be subtraction. I've already used all the numbers I've been given because when I set it up, I'm going to say the width is 6.25 minus 3.5 because I know that width is 3.5 yards less than the length. I'll come back to this one later because I need to solve it first. Same with this one. And I do have mixed fractions, so let's go ahead and change those to improper fractions. So the width is equal to, 6 times 4 is 24 plus 1 is 25. And then I need to change this one so that I know the denominator is 2, so that becomes 7 because 2 times 3 is 6 plus 1 is 7. Okay, and then, so I've done this. I don't have a percentage, so I don't really have to worry about that, and then we'll come back to simplifying later. Okay, so let's check. First, to subtract, I do need to have the same denominator, so I'm going to multiply this by 2 over 2. And what that does is it makes it 25 over 4 minus 14 over 4. Now my denominators match, and I can just subtract the tops. 25 minus 14 is 11 over 4, and that's my width. So I could leave it as this. I could say 11 over 4 yards. Or I could say, if I wanted to change it back to a mixed fraction, I could also say this is 2 3/4 yards. Either way, it's fine. It means the same thing. Okay. So there we go. I made sure my answer makes sense. It's positive. I put units in my answer, and it's the simplest form of the fraction. Easy. See, that picture made it so much easier. Okay, so let's try again. To adjust for inflation, a company gives its employees a 10% increase for the coming year. If an employee was previously making $60,000 a year, how much will they make next year? So for this one, it's kind of harder to draw a picture, but I can at least do some kind of organization. So I can say he made this year was $60,000. I'm going to do plus 10% of 60,000. And see, there's the of, which means we're going to be using multiplication. And then that's going to give me my total next year. So I organize my information, and that will help me solve it later. So another tip we had was when it was a percentage to change it to a decimal. 10% as a decimal is equal to 0.10, but we can leave it as 0.1. So in order to use that, we're going to do 0.1 times 60,000, which will give us 6,000. So now I can put that back in here. I have 60,000 plus 6,000. So next year, this employee will be making $66,000. And that makes sense. It's more than the previous year. It's still in dollars, and we were able to apply that. So whenever it says 10% of something or 20% or 30%, you just change it to a decimal, and then you multiply it by the big number, by the total that you're applying it to. All right, my last example. 9/20 of Americans have brown eyes. So I'm going to say this is 9/20 of brown eyes. And of these, 3/4 have naturally occurring brown hair. Okay, here's another key word, of. So that means we're going to be using multiplication. And so 3/4 of these are going to have naturally occurring brown hair. What fraction of Americans have brown eyes and brown hair? So because it's a multiplication problem and I need to use both of these numbers, I'm going to do 9/20 times 3/4. And then if you remember, we just multiply across, so this becomes 27 over 80. And that's it. So 27 over 80 people have brown eyes and brown hair, because I just had to multiply it. Whenever you see the word of, multiply those fractions together. And that usually just solves whatever you're working on. More specific to fractions, but draw pictures is seriously my #1 recommendation for solving word